There's so much great music in the world. Anytime anyone writes a song, they're competing with billions of other great songs. Yeah. I think about, man, I have to perform songs every single night or every other night.
For years, Bruno Mars has been seen as the definition of perfection in music. Effortless hits, electric performances, and a career that rarely shows cracks. But behind that image, whispers have followed him for just as long. Stories, rumors, and unanswered questions that never fully went away.
His live performance, he wants to make it like a party.
Well, that's my cheat code. My point was to always say, it's not your job to know it. I'm gonna do it.
Now at 39, Bruno Mars is finally addressing it all. Not through lyrics or interviews, but through a raw confession that changes how people see his story. The real origin of Bruno Mars. Long before Bruno Mars became a global sensation, he was already living a life most people would find unbelievable for a child. At just 4 years old, Bruno wasn't learning how to ride a bike or memorize alphabet songs like other kids his age. Instead, he was stepping onto real stages, performing night after night in front of live audiences. Music wasn't something he discovered later in life. It was the environment he was raised in. His family ran a small entertainment act in Waikiki, Hawaii, where performances weren't occasional events but part of their daily survival. And somewhere in the middle of that, little Bruno became the centerpiece of the show. Dressed in flashy outfits and taught to imitate Elvis Presley, he wasn't just performing, he was becoming a character on stage. The crowd response was immediate. People didn't just see a child performing, they saw a presence that felt far beyond his age. That's where the nickname started, Little Elvis. But what made it even more unusual was how natural it all seemed. While most children struggled with confidence, Bruno was already learning timing, rhythm, stage control, and audience connection before he even understood what those things meant. By the time 1990 arrived, when he was only 5 years old, Bruno had already stepped onto one of the biggest early stages of his life, performing at the Aloha Bowl halftime show in front of tens of thousands of people. For a child, it should have been overwhelming. Instead, it felt like home. A year later, he appeared on national television on the Arsenio Hall show. And not long after that, he even landed a small film role in Honeymoon in Vegas, earning a paycheck that, at the time, felt like a victory, but would later become a symbolic memory of how early his career had started. Before most kids even reach middle school, Bruno Mars had already performed hundreds of live shows. The stage wasn't something he grew into. It was something he was built aside of, but what looks like a dream from the outside often hides a deeper reality. When Bruno was 12 years old, everything changed. His parents divorced, and the family performance act that once held their entire world together collapsed. The income stopped, the stability disappeared, and suddenly, the child who had grown up under stage lights was facing something very different: uncertainty. Life became unstable fast. There were nights when he, his father, and his brother had nowhere permanent to stay. Sometimes they slept inside an old car parked in Waikiki. Other nights they found shelter wherever they could, even rooftops or abandoned spaces that were never meant for living. Basic comfort became a luxury. Showers were taken secretly at hotel pools, meals were cheap and repetitive, often just whatever they could afford at convenience stores. There were even stretches of time where electricity wasn't available at home, forcing Bruno to practice music in silence or under dim light. And still, he didn't stop. At school, things weren't easier. Kids noticed his situation, his clothes, his differences. He stood out, and not always in a good way. But instead of pulling away from music, he leaned into it even harder. To make money, he performed as a Michael Jackson impersonator, earning small amounts per night. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept him moving forward, paying for demo recordings, transportation, and anything related to music. That period didn't just build resilience, it built obsession. By the early 2000s, Bruno had started sending out demo recordings, hoping someone in the industry would notice. And eventually, they did. but not in the way he expected. Executives saw potential, but they tried to reshape him. They suggested he become something else entirely, a packaged image, a marketable direction, a version of an artist he didn't recognize himself in. That was the moment Bruno faced a decision that would define everything that came after. He could either become what the industry wanted or become what he truly was. And in choosing himself, he also chose a new identity, one that would soon carry him from unknown songwriter to global phenomenon. But at that point, he wasn't Bruno Mars yet. He was just a young artist in Los Angeles, standing at the edge of a dream that either had to break him or make him. And what happened next would introduce the people who would eventually help shape his entire career. The hidden grind behind Bruno Mars' first breakthrough. In Los Angeles, talent alone isn't enough to survive. Connection matters, timing matters, and sometimes one unexpected meeting can completely change a career. For Bruno Mars, that moment came when he crossed paths with Philip Lawrence, another artist trying to break into the same industry that had already turned away so many dreamers. There was no instant success between them, no industry backing, no guarantees, just two young musicians sharing the same frustration, the same ambition, and the same refusal to quit. They didn't just connect creatively, they connected through struggle. Together, they made a decision that would quietly shape the future of pop music. If the industry wouldn't give them a seat at the table, they would build their own sound so undeniable that the industry would have no choice but to listen. That mindset became the foundation of what they later called the Smeezingtons. At first, there was nothing glamorous about it. No high-end studio, no expensive equipment, no record label funding, just late nights, borrowed space, and whatever resources they could pull together. Most of their early writing sessions happened in extremely unconventional places, sometimes inside an old car parked outside a small studio in Hollywood. The studio belonged to Ari Levine, an engineer who had the technical setup they needed, but not the budget to pay assistants or collaborators. So they made it work in the only way they could. Instead of money, they offered something else: food, small favors, and pure determination. It wasn't business. It was survival disguised as creativity. And slowly, something started forming. A rhythm, a process, a system. Whenever something in a song felt right, a melody, a lyric, a beat, they would react instantly. That's it. That's the one. Eventually, those quick reactions turned into a code word that stuck: Smeeze. That single word became their identity. The Smeezingtons weren't just a group. They were a self-built songwriting engine. They studied music like scientists, breaking down hit songs, analyzing structures, and understanding why certain sounds connected with people. Before releasing anything major, they had already dissected over 1,000 tracks, just to understand the formula behind success. But the real turning point didn't come from their own music. It came from a simple CD. Bruno's sister quietly handed one of his demos to an industry contact. At first, it almost didn't matter. The voice sounded unusual, even too high for mainstream expectations. Some people didn't take it seriously. But then something happened. A specific moment in one of the tracks caught attention, a vocal shift that stood out so sharply it couldn't be ignored. That single detail made someone stop, rewind, and listen again. And that rewind changed everything. Suddenly, Bruno Mars wasn't just another unknown artist. He was someone worth watching. A meeting was arranged. No contract yet, no promises. But for the first time, the door to the industry cracked open just enough to let him through. Still, recognition doesn't solve survival. Bills were still real, rent was still due, and success was still far away. So the team kept going. They sold songs meant for themselves to other artists just to stay afloat. One track was even sold for enough money to prevent eviction, a painful but necessary trade-off for survival. And then, slowly, the hits started forming in the background. Songs Bruno helped write, that would soon explode across the charts without the world even realizing who was behind them. Because before Bruno Mars became a global name, he was already building the sound that would define him. And what came next would push him from behind-the-scenes writer to center-stage superstar. The quiet explosion. Bruno Mars enters the spotlight alone. Bruno Mars didn't become a global superstar in one dramatic moment. There was no sudden explosion, no instant fame story where everything changed overnight. Instead, his rise came in waves, slow at first, almost invisible, until suddenly the entire world was listening. It began with something so small most people barely noticed it, a short project titled, "It's Better If You Don't Understand." It wasn't marketed like a major debut. It didn't dominate headlines. In fact, it felt more like a quiet introduction than an official launch. The project was brief, just a handful of tracks, barely long enough to feel like a full album experience. When it was released in May 2010, it didn't create immediate impact. No massive chart entries, no viral moment, just a subtle release, sitting in the background of a music industry already crowded with louder names. By the end of the following year, sales were still extremely modest. On paper, it looked like a small experiment, something most artists would move on from without looking back. But beneath its quiet surface, something important was forming. Those early songs carried a certain emotional weight and melodic instinct that hadn't fully revealed itself yet. It was like watching a seed that hadn't bloomed, but already had the shape of something much bigger waiting underneath. And then everything shifted. Only a few months later, Bruno released his first full studio album, Doo-Wops and Hooligans. The difference was immediate. Where the earlier project was quiet, this one was impossible to ignore. The album didn't rely on trends or heavy production gimmicks. Instead, it leaned into something more timeless. Simple melodies, emotional storytelling, and vocal delivery that felt both classic and modern at the same time. And it worked. Almost instantly, songs from the album began climbing charts around the world. The budget behind the project was relatively small compared to industry standards, but the impact it created was anything but small. The real turning point came with the singles. Just the Way You Are didn't just perform well, it took over. It entered the Billboard Hot 100 and, within weeks, climbed all the way to #1. It stayed on the charts for nearly a full year, becoming one of those rare songs that didn't just peak. It lingered, dominated, and defined an era. But Bruno didn't stop there. The next wave came with Grenade, a darker, more intense track that showed a completely different side of his artistry. Where the first hit felt soft and romantic, this one felt heavy and emotional, pulling listeners into a completely different space. And again, the reaction was massive. Both songs weren't just successful, they were everywhere. Radio, television, clubs, playlists. It felt like Bruno Mars had suddenly appeared in every direction at once, even though the foundation had been building quietly for years. By this point, the industry could no longer treat him as a newcomer. He wasn't emerging anymore. He had arrived. Awards followed. Recognition followed. Grammy nominations came in rapidly, placing him in conversations alongside artists who had been in the game far longer than he had. Even in his early awards run, he was already being compared to legendary performers. Not because of hype, but because of results. But here's where the story becomes even more interesting. Because success at that level doesn't slow things down, it speeds everything up. New expectations started forming around him. Pressure increased. Labels wanted more hits, faster releases, and a clearer definition of what kind of artist he was supposed to be. But Bruno Mars wasn't built for simple categories. He wasn't just a pop singer. He wasn't just a songwriter. And he definitely wasn't someone who stayed in one lane. Behind the success, a new challenge was forming, one that would test not just his talent, but his control over his own identity as an artist. And instead of slowing down after global fame, Bruno made a decision that surprised everyone in the industry. He didn't repeat the formula. He rebuilt it from scratch. And that decision would lead him straight into a new era, one that would redefine what people thought he was capable of. Because just when the world thought they understood Bruno Mars, he was about to take everything even further. And what came next would prove that his biggest transformation was still ahead of him: the making of a record-breaking world tour. By the time Bruno Mars stepped into his next phase, the industry wasn't just watching him anymore, it was studying him. Every move he made carried weight, every release felt like an event, and every performance reminded people that he wasn't just another pop star, he was becoming a standard. The shift became undeniable at the Grammys. Unorthodox Jukebox didn't just compete, it dominated. The album secured major wins, including Best Pop Vocal Album, solidifying Bruno's place at the top tier of modern music. Behind the scenes, engineers revealed something even more impressive. Each track was built with an unusually high number of layered recordings, creating a depth of sound that most albums at the time didn't even attempt. But what really shocked people wasn't just the awards. It was the energy. During one of his performances that night, Bruno delivered a moment so brief that it barely lasted a second. Yet, it triggered unexpected attention from viewers and even regulatory complaints. Nothing serious followed, but the incident became strangely symbolic. Even his smallest actions were now being noticed at a massive scale. And then came the explosion: Uptown Funk. At first, it didn't look like a guaranteed hit. It started as a loose creative session, not a polished industry project. A simple idea recorded casually, almost like a jam rather than a structured production. But once released, everything changed. The song didn't just climb charts, it took over culture. For weeks, it stayed #1, dominating radio, clubs, weddings, commercials, and social media. It became unavoidable. At its peak, it earned massive daily streams and became one of the era's most replayed songs, standing out with its nostalgic sound amid electronic trends. It didn't follow the industry. It pulled the industry backward into something familiar, fun, and timeless. That success pushed Bruno into a new level of recognition. Suddenly, he wasn't just delivering hits, he was shaping direction. Artists, producers, and labels began reacting to his style instead of the other way around. And then came the next turning point, the decision that confused the industry. Instead of creating a massive, overloaded project packed with trends, Bruno took a different route. He stripped things down. He leaned into simplicity. He focused on sound, groove, and identity, rather than chasing complexity or quantity. People questioned it. Some executives weren't sure it would work. But Bruno wasn't trying to impress the industry anymore. He was building something that felt personal again, something rooted in old-school influence, live instrumentation, and pure musical character. And that risk would lead to one of the most important live eras of his career. A world tour that didn't just showcase his music, but proved he could command any stage, anywhere in the world, on his own terms. Because what came next wasn't just about songs anymore. It was about proving he could own the entire global stage. The final reinvention of a modern superstar. Even after dominating charts and selling out arenas worldwide, Bruno Mars wasn't done evolving. In a surprise turn, he stepped into a completely different creative world, one that didn't follow modern pop trends at all. Instead, he went backward in time. That shift became Silk Sonic, his collaboration with Anderson .Paak, a project built around vintage soul, funk, and the sound of another era entirely. It didn't begin with a traditional rollout. It started with mystery. Late one night in Las Vegas, Bruno appeared on stage in a gold suit, announcing the arrival of Silk Sonic in front of a stunned audience. No long explanation, no industry build-up, just a performance that instantly transported people into a different musical world. Their debut single, Leave the Door Open, didn't just perform well, it took over. It climbed to #1 quickly and stayed there for weeks, becoming one of the defining songs of its time. Its sound felt effortless, but every detail was carefully crafted to feel like it came straight out of a 1970s studio session. The project grew into a full album that leaned heavily into analog recording, live instrumentation, and old-school production techniques. No shortcuts, no digital over-polish, just pure musical craftsmanship. At the Grammys, Silk Sonic didn't just show up. They dominated, sweeping major categories and reinforcing Bruno Mars's ability to reinvent himself without losing relevance. Even their live performances became moments people talked about for days, blending nostalgia with precision and showmanship that only a few artists in the world could deliver. And just when it seemed like Bruno had already reached every peak possible, he kept going. From global pop dominance to retro reinvention to cultural impact that crossed generations, Silk Sonic wasn't just another project. It was proof that Bruno Mars wasn't chasing eras. He was creating them. And the question now is no longer what he's done, but what he will change next. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment your thoughts below. Stay tuned for more stories like this, and we'll see you in the next video.